Okay, so Raman's been used relatively extensively, I'd say, to evaluate the origin and the nature of carbonaceous matter in some of the Earth's oldest rocks. Hasn't been used so much in the Cambrian, though. And Raman is used predominantly in these studies to look at the structural order of carbon, because the structural order of carbon gives an indicator of metamorphic grade. It's influenced heavily by peak temperature. So the structural order of carbon will record the peak temperature that the carbon in the rock has been exposed to. So today, relatively simple task for me. I'm just going to give you a bunch of Cambrian Lagerstädts and provide a bit of detail on the carbon and a bit of temperature detail as well. So what does the carbon spectra actually look like under Raman? You'll see two peaks, the D and the G. The G stands for graphite and the D stands for disorder. So if you heat carbon up to like 650 degrees or something, cook it, becomes very ordered, very like structurally intact, and you get the one peak, which is the D peak. Now, the lower temperature, well, carbon that has been exposed to lower temperature, you'll start to see this D peak pop up, and this is the disorder peak. Now, eventually the G peak will disappear and it will become the D2 peak as it becomes more disordered, and this D peak will become shouldered by more disorder with a D3, a D4, a D5 until it becomes as convoluted. Oh, it's gone. As convoluted as the lyrics to The Safety Dance by Canadian synth pop duo Men Without Hats. I'm still trying to work that out. I found out the other day what that song is actually about, but it didn't really make much sense. It's an anti-authoritarian song. Apparently, the lead singer wrote it after he got kicked out of a pub for pogoing, which was a 80s dance move where you jump up and down in various directions like a pogo stick. Learn something new every day. A bit of a knowledge nugget. So, Cambrian Lagerstädt specimens from around the world. And I did point spectra, so that's important. Point spectra, can't really do mapping with directly on specimens because of the topographic relief. So now for some results. Okay, Zhang, Emu Bay, heated around to 150 degrees. You'll see this is a D2 peak. The D1 peak's very broad, lots of shouldered from disordered, very amorphous. If anything, advanced diagenesis, really. We're going to move through these pretty quickly, actually, if the button works. There we go. Gushang Biota is also advanced diagenesis, really a little bit warmer. It's a big jump then to the Wheeler Shale. We actually start getting a G peak. You'll notice the D1 peak is higher than the G, but you've still got these shoulders of the D3 and the D4.
Point to get the other way.
Oh, that'll be doing it. All right, I'll point it at the computer. The Latham Shale, the Spent Shale, very similar Raman spectra, very similar temperatures. You'll see, the one thing to notice is that the width of the D1 and the G are narrowing, and this is evidence of increased temperature. Burgess Shale and the Weeks Formation, once again, very similar. What to note with the Weeks Formation is that this trough between the D1 and G are getting lower, which means that the D3 and the D4 bands are having less of an influence. And also you start seeing this little shoulder here of the D2. And this happens when you increase the temperature, the G band actually lowers in wavelength and separates from the D2. So you can start, that's another evidence for increasing temperature. And finally, we have the Sirius Passet, although Nick wrecked this earlier, not that it's anything to be wrecked, but it's the winner here at 400 degrees, essentially. You'll note the D1 and the D and the G bands are exactly the same intensity. The bands are really narrow, quite well defined. The trough here at the bottom is quite low, and the D4 and the D3 are not even present on all samples. So this is really being cooked quite heavily, and you'll start noticing the D2 shoulder as well. So here's a quick summary of all the Lagerstädtens really quickly that I've just talked about then. This is the average spectra, but it's also quite a nice evolution through the actual carbon spectra that's increasing with temperature from The advanced diagenesis, 150 degrees in the Chen Zhang and Emu Bay, up to over 400 probably upper green schist facies of the Sirius Passet formation. So it's just really interesting that we're seeing this Burgess shale type preservation still present in a whole range of temperatures. Since there was really no other, since there was no other Cambrian data to really compare this with, I went to the Archean record because this is where predominantly Raman has been utilised. And Raman is utilised in the Archean world to look at and to the thermal maturity of sedimentary basins, to look at the structural order of the carbon, and to identify the best areas to look for traces of life. That's what they're using Raman for. And this is called the Carbonization Continuum that was done by Delarue last year. And so he plotted up all the non-Archean with a whole bunch of Archean examples, and he noted that the non-Archean was, in general, low metamorphism, essentially. So they showed these low values here, and all the Archean showed these high values that have been around for a little longer, they've been metamorphosed, they've been heated, they've been matured, they've been affected. And so he thought the best places to look for life in the Archean would be Archean samples that show the ratios that plot out closely to the non-Archean examples of carbon, which are definitely biological. And this was this little area here called the Dresser, with the Dresser formation and the apex chert. And the thing to note here is that although the Gushang and the Emu Bay and the Chen Zhang are very close to this, none of the other Cambrian Lagerstädts map very close to this supposed dreamlike area that would be a perfect place to find traces of life in the Archean. So it's just interesting that in these, if this was Archean rocks, the Burgess shale, the Weeks, the Spence, and the Sirius Passet wouldn't even be identified as having, they'd be too thermally matured to be bothered to look for traces of life. Last but not least, this is the Raman Index preservation that was developed by Schoff et al. To look at morphological fidelity based on Raman spectra. And initially, when I set out to do this project, this is what I wanted to do, really. And so Schoff looked at all these Raman spectra from around the world and gave them a rating, 9 being, yeah, whoop-de-doo, excellent, and 1 being less than ideal. And those weren't exactly his words. I take that back. But he essentially got an index looking at the value of this shoulder on the D band in relation to the entire D band. So the higher the ratio of the shoulder to the D band meant that the fossils were better preserved. So he had all these as a 9 and down all the way to 1. So I stuck on the Cambrian examples. And really, according to his scale, although it was to microfossils, I don't know if this can be applied to macrofossils, the only examples which actually got high morphological fidelity are the Chen Zhang, Emu Bay, and maybe the Gushang. But everything else is, well, the Burgess shale has a RIP of 3, and the Sirius Passet doesn't even go on the. It's a bit unfair, really. It's closer to 0, apparently. So, which is a bit unfair, I think. So I don't think you could actually use the RIP, which was admittedly based on microfossils, to the macrofossil world. And considering I would arguably say that Chen Zhang and Burgess shale have fantastic morphological fidelity, but they are on either end of the spectra at 130 and close to 330 degrees. So while I was looking for this nice little relationship between temperature and morphological fidelity, I think the story is a little bit more difficult than that and a bit more complex. So thank you very much. And I went through this a little quicker, probably quicker than Mitchell Stark through the English batting lineup. I had to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, Graham. But yeah, come and talk to me if you have any questions later. Thanks very much.